The man had lived isolated in the mountains for years, until 10 injured strangers arrived seeking help. Robert Miller swallowed hard when he heard the desperate knocks on the wooden door. For 8 years, no one had visited his cabin hidden in the Appalachian Mountains, and now distressed voices were shouting for help outside. The storm that had been lashing the region since early afternoon had intensified, and thunder echoed through the valleys like cannon shots. Robert stood motionless by the fireplace, his hands shaking not just from the cold, seeping through the cracks of the rustic structure. "Please, is anyone there? We need help." A woman's voice cut through the noise of the torrential rain. He squeezed his eyes shut. During all those years of voluntary isolation, he had built a strict routine that kept him away from the world and other people. He woke before dawn, tended to his small garden, repaired the cabin, read his few books, and went to bed early. Nothing and no one disturbed his controlled, predictable life. "My God, there's an elderly woman here in bad shape. She has a very high fever," a younger man's voice shouted. Robert felt his heart race. He couldn't ignore someone who was sick, no matter how much he wanted to stay isolated. He walked to the window and peered through the torn curtains. Through the curtain of rain, he could make out a group of drenched people, clearly in desperate straits. He took a deep breath and opened the heavy door. The first thing he saw was a woman in her 60s cradled in the arms of a younger man, clearly unconscious with a fever-flushed face. Behind him, 9 others huddled together, all soaked to the bone and visibly shaken. "Come in, quickly," Robert said, stepping aside. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much," said a young woman around 25, helping carry some of the injured inside. As the group entered, Robert began to grasp the severity of the situation. Several people had cuts and bruises, and all seemed to be in shock. The small cabin, which comfortably housed 1 person, suddenly felt overcrowded. "What happened to you?" he asked, while helping settle the sick woman onto his own cot. "Our bus skidded off the road down below," explained a middle-aged man with a cut on his forehead. "We were coming back from Mr. Thompson's farm, where we worked the harvest. The rain made the road slippery and the driver lost control." Robert nodded, but something bothered him. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the trauma of the accident. His eyes scanned the group until they landed on a man standing apart in the corner of the cabin. When their gazes met, Robert felt as if an icy fist clenched his stomach. "Michael," he murmured, his voice coming out more like a groan than a word. "Hey, bro," Michael replied, lowering his eyes. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out." Now, back to the story. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder outside. Robert's legs felt weak, and he had to lean against the wall. The others in the group immediately sensed the tension between the 2 men, and the murmurs died down. "Do you know each other?" asked the young woman who had helped with the injured. "He's my brother," Robert answered, his voice rough. "Brother?" The woman looked from one to the other, confused. "But then, it's been 8 years since we last saw each other," Michael interrupted, still avoiding direct eye contact with Robert. The older woman who had fainted began to stir and mumble something unintelligible. Robert moved closer, and when he saw her face in the dim firelight, his world collapsed all over again. "Mrs. Eleanor," he whispered. It was his former mother-in-law, the mother of Elizabeth, his ex-wife, the woman who for 15 years had treated him like a son, who had welcomed him into her family as if he were blood, the same one he had left behind when he discovered the betrayal that destroyed his life. Robert Miller," murmured Mrs. Eleanor in delirium, her eyes still closed. "My boy, where are you?" Tears welled up in Robert Miller's eyes before he could stop them. For 8 years he had tried to forget not just Elizabeth and Michael, but also the loved ones he'd lost when he ran away from everything. "You know him too?" asked one of the men in the group, an older gentleman with graying hair. "She's my mother-in-law," Robert replied, his voice choked. "She was my mother-in-law." "Mother-in-law? But you 2 are brothers." The young woman frowned, trying to understand. Michael shifted uncomfortably in the corner. I married his ex-wife," he admitted, lowering his head even further. The impact of the revelation made several people in the group exchange meaningful glances. The young woman, who clearly had some medical knowledge from the way she had examined the injured, approached Robert. "My name is Jennifer Smith. I'm a nurse at the hospital in Asheville," she said softly. "She has a very high fever. We need to bring her temperature down urgently." Robert nodded, trying to focus on the medical situation rather than the emotional pain tearing through his chest again. "I have some medicine here, but it's not much," he said, heading to an improvised cabinet. "My medical supplies were in the bus luggage," Jennifer said. "We need to go down there and recover whatever we can." "It's impossible in this storm," Robert said, looking out the window. "The trail gets too dangerous with all this rain." "Then she might not make it through the night." Jennifer lowered her voice, but everyone heard. Robert looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who was still delirious and calling his name. Even after everything that had happened, he couldn't bear the thought of letting that woman suffer. "I know an alternate trail," he finally said. "It's longer but safer. I can try to go down and get the medical supplies." "You can't go out alone in this storm," Jennifer protested. "I'll go with him," Michael said, stepping out from the corner where he'd been. Robert turned sharply to his brother. "I don't need your help." "Robert, for God's sake," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Eleanor is dying. This isn't the time for our differences." "Our differences?" Robert let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you call what you did?" The whole group fell silent, sensing the weight of the untold story between the two brothers. An older man who had stayed quiet until then stepped forward. "Forgive me for intruding, but you two need to put the past aside now," he said firmly. "People here need help, and you're the only ones who know the area." Robert took a deep breath. The man was right. Mrs. Eleanor had always been good to him, and she wasn't to blame for the problems between him and Michael. "Fine," he finally said, "but you stay behind if you can't keep up." Michael nodded, clearly relieved not to have been completely rejected. Robert grabbed his strongest flashlight, a rope, and some other mountaineering gear he'd kept from the days when he still led guided hikes. He had almost forgotten there was a time he made a living, taking tourists through the local mountains. "Take good care of her," he told Jennifer, referring to Mrs. Eleanor. "Keep her warm and try to get her to drink water when she's conscious." "I'll do what I can," the nurse promised. Before leaving, Robert took one last look at his mother-in-law. Even with a fever and clearly weakened, she still maintained that sweet expression he loved so much. Mrs. Eleanor had been the mother he never truly had, since his own had passed away when he was a teenager. "Let's go," he said to Michael, opening the door. The storm was still raging, and the two brothers stepped out into the mountain darkness, carrying only a flashlight and a heavy tension between them. The path to the accident site would be long and dangerous, especially with the rain turning the earth into slippery mud. They walked for nearly an hour in silence, only the sound of the rain and their labored breaths breaking the quiet. Robert Miller knew every stone, every tree, every bend of those trails. For 8 years, he had walked them every day as a form of exercise and meditation. "Robert," Michael finally broke the silence when they stopped to rest under a large tree. "I don't want to talk about it," Robert cut in. "But I need to," Michael insisted. "You have no idea how guilty I feel every day." "Guilty?" Robert turned to face his brother. "You destroyed my life, Michael. You destroyed my family, and you feel guilty." "I know there's no excuse for what I did," Michael lowered his head, "but things didn't happen the way you think." "Oh, really? Then explain to me how you ended up in bed with my wife." Michael stayed silent for a few seconds, clearly struggling for words. "Elizabeth, she was suffering, Robert. The two of you had been in crisis for months. You were working too much, barely coming home. And that justifies it?" Robert felt the old anger surging back. "No, of course it doesn't justify it." Michael raised his hands. "I'm just trying to explain it wasn't premeditated. It wasn't a conspiracy against you. But it happened, over and over, for months." Robert spat the words. "And you were my brother, my best friend." Silence fell between them again. Robert remembered how he had discovered the betrayal. He'd come home early from work one day when he was feeling sick and found Michael and Elizabeth together in his own bed. The image still haunted him every night. "She looked for you, you know," Michael said softly. "What?" "Elizabeth. After you left. She searched for you for almost 2 years. Went to your office. asked your friends, even hired a detective to find you. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. During his first years in the mountains, he had often imagined Elizabeth coming after him, begging for forgiveness. But as time passed, he had assumed she had simply moved on without looking back. Why are you telling me this now? Because she regretted it, Robert, deeply. In her last years, she could barely live with the guilt. What do you mean, her last years? Michael hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. Elizabeth, she passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. Robert felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Even after all the pain she had caused, he still held feelings for Elizabeth. They had been together since their teens, married for 15 years. You couldn't just erase an entire history. Why didn't you try to find me to tell me? How? You vanished off the face of the earth. No one knew where you were. Robert didn't answer. It was true. He had severed all ties with his old life when he retreated to the mountains. He changed his name on official documents, cut contact with everyone, lived practically as a hermit. She left a letter for you, Michael said, pulling a yellowed envelope from his jacket pocket. Robert stared at it as if it were a bomb. I don't want to read it. Robert, I said I don't want to read it, he exploded. Do you think a letter can fix 8 years of my life thrown away? Will it bring back the son she and I were trying to have? Will it return all the plans we made together? Michael tucked the letter back into his pocket, respecting his brother's decision. They resumed walking in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the accident site, they found the bus overturned on the side of the dirt road. The rain had eased slightly, but still fell persistently. Robert Miller used his flashlight to scan the vehicle's interior, searching for a medical bag or anything that could help Mrs. Eleanor. Here, Michael said, spotting a backpack with a red cross painted on the side. Robert took the bag and checked its contents. There were some fever medications, gauze, disinfectant, and other basic supplies. It wasn't much, but it could make a difference. Let's head back, he said, slinging the bag over his shoulder. The return journey felt even longer. The trail was slicker, and at times they had to grip branches and rocks to keep from slipping. Robert noticed Michael struggling to keep up, but said nothing. Robert, Michael called when they stopped to rest again. What? You know I've never forgiven myself for what I did to you, right? Robert didn't answer, but Michael continued. Not a single day passed in those 8 years when I didn't think about you. I couldn't truly be happy, not even for a moment. Elizabeth couldn't either. And you think that makes me happy? No. I just want you to know we both paid the price for what we did, especially her. Robert stopped walking and turned to face Michael. What do you mean by that? Elizabeth. She never got over what we did to you. Fell into deep depression, started drinking. When she found out she was sick, she even said it was punishment. Don't talk like that, Robert said, a pang in his chest. It's true. She blamed herself so much she refused treatment at first. I had to beg her to fight for her life. Robert pictured Elizabeth sick, suffering, and felt a confusing mix of anger, sadness, and pity. No matter how she had betrayed him, he had loved that woman for more than half his life. Why are you telling me all this? Because you have the right to know the truth. And because I hoped one day we could talk like brothers again. Brothers? Robert let out a bitter laugh. Brothers don't do what you did to me. You're right. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But Mrs. Eleanor, she does. She suffered just as much as you in all this. Robert thought of his mother-in-law, who had lost contact with him when he isolated himself in the mountains. Mrs. Eleanor truly wasn't to blame for anything and had always been like a second mother to him. When they returned to the cabin, the group was even more tense. Mrs. Eleanor was awake but clearly very weak. Jennifer Smith had managed to lower her fever slightly with cold compresses, but was still worried. "Did you get the medicine?" she asked anxiously. Robert handed over the medical bag, and Jennifer quickly checked its contents. "Perfect. This will help a lot," she said, already preparing fever medication. As Jennifer tended to Mrs. Eleanor, Robert noticed the atmosphere in the group had shifted. People avoided looking at him and Michael, whispering among themselves. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, back to the story. Did something happen while we were gone? Robert asked. The older man who had spoken to them earlier stepped forward. My name is Gerald. Gerald Peterson, he said. I knew your father, George. We worked together at Mr. Wilson's sawmill a long time ago. Robert Miller nodded. He vaguely remembered the name. Your brother told us his version of the story while you were away, Gerald continued. Robert felt his blood boil. What version? He said you had issues with violence, that you hit your wife and that's why she left you. Robert turned to Michael with a mix of shock and fury. You said what? I had to explain why you two weren't speaking, Michael stammered. So you decided to make up that I hit Elizabeth? That's not how I said it. Then how did you say it? Robert stepped closer to his brother, fists clenched. The group backed away, clearly afraid the situation would turn violent. Easy, easy, Gerald intervened, stepping between the two brothers. Let's all take a deep breath here. He's spreading lies about me, Robert exploded. Robert, please, said Jennifer Smith, who had stopped tending to Mrs. Eleanor to watch the argument. She's very weak, she needs peace and quiet. Robert looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who was watching him with clear eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. Robert, she murmured, trying to prop herself up on her elbows. Is it really you, my boy? All the emotions Robert had tried to suppress that night erupted at once. He knelt beside the cot and took his mother-in-law's hand. Yes, Mrs. Eleanor, it's me. My boy. She touched his bearded face. You've gotten so thin and so sad. Tears streamed freely down Robert's face. I missed you so much, he admitted. I missed you too, son. I prayed every day for you to come back. Mrs. Eleanor, Michael interrupted, stepping forward cautiously. You need to rest. Michael, Mrs. Eleanor said, turning to him, it's time to tell the truth. What truth? Asked Jennifer, clearly confused by the whole situation. Mrs. Eleanor tried to sit up, and Robert helped her. My boy never laid a hand on any woman, she said, looking straight at the group. Robert is the kindest, gentlest man I know. But then why? One of the women in the group began to ask. Elizabeth cheated on me with my own brother, Robert said, his voice breaking. That's why we haven't spoken in 8 years. The group fell silent, processing the information. Jennifer looked from Robert to Michael, clearly reassessing her understanding of the situation. And there's more, Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice weak but firm. Michael, tell him about the photos. What photos? Robert asked. Michael visibly squirmed. Mrs. Eleanor, you're too weak. Tell him, Michael, she insisted, with a strength that surprised everyone. I've kept this secret long enough. Michael took a deep breath. Robert, I manipulated some photos to make it look like you were violent with Elizabeth. What do you mean? Remember when you hurt yourself playing soccer and bruised your arm? And Elizabeth had some scratches because you two had gone hiking? Robert nodded, not understanding where Michael was going with this. I took pictures of you both with those injuries and changed the context, made it look like you'd hit her. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert felt like the ground had vanished beneath his feet. Why? He finally managed to ask. Because I needed an excuse for the betrayal, Michael admitted, tears now streaming down his face. I needed everyone to believe you were a monster, so what I did wouldn't seem as bad. My God, Jennifer murmured. I showed these photos to friends, to family, and especially to Elizabeth, Michael continued. I convinced her that you were becoming violent and that she was in danger. Robert Miller felt as if he had been struck by lightning. The entire story he believed about their separation was a lie fabricated by his own brother. Elizabeth believed that. At first, no, said Mrs. Eleanor, her voice trembling. She knew you would never lay a hand on her. But Michael was very convincing. He crafted a version that made her believe she was helping you escape a toxic relationship. And you knew about this? Robert looked at his mother-in-law. I suspected something was wrong. I'd known you for 15 years. I knew the kind of man you were. But I had no proof, and I didn't have the courage to confront my own daughter. Robert stood up and walked to the window, trying to process everything. His entire life had been destroyed by a lie orchestrated by his own brother. "That's why she reached out to you later," Michael said. "When she found out the truth about the photos. I ended up telling her when she was sick." "You told a terminally ill woman that her whole life was based on a lie?" Jennifer Smith asked, clearly shocked. "She had the right to know," Michael said defensively. "And I didn't," Robert snapped, turning sharply. "I didn't have the right to know my wife was manipulated into betraying me?" "I tried to find you," Michael said, "but you had completely disappeared." "Liar," Robert shouted. "You didn't even try, because you knew if I found out the truth, I'd end you." The tension in the cabin was almost unbearable. The others in the group kept their distance, clearly uncomfortable. Jennifer went back to tending to Mrs. Eleanor, who had grown agitated during the argument. "Enough!" Gerald raised his voice. "You're both being selfish. There are injured people here, a sick woman, and all you care about are your own problems." Robert took a deep breath, trying to regain control. Gerald was right. This wasn't the time for personal grudges. "You're right," he said, running his hands through his hair. "I'm sorry, all of you. You shouldn't have had to witness this." "Robert," a woman's voice called. He turned and saw a woman in her 40s who had stayed quiet until now. "My name is Patricia. I lost my husband 6 months ago. I know the pain of losing someone we love." Robert nodded, recognizing the sincerity in her voice. "What I've learned is that holding on to bitterness only hurts yourself," Patricia continued. "I'm not saying you have to forgive your brother, but maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself." "What do you mean?" "You isolated yourself up here in the mountains for 8 years, cut off everyone who loved you, punished yourself for something that wasn't even your fault." Robert looked around the cabin. It was true. His life had been reduced to these 4 walls and the lonely routine he'd created. No friends, no contact with anyone, living as if the world had ended in 2016. "And you?" he asked Patricia. "How are you coping with losing your husband?" "Not well," she admitted with a sad smile. "But at least I'm not isolating myself. I have my kids, my friends, my work. Life goes on, even with the pain." Robert realized, ironically, that he had dealt with his suffering in the worst possible way. While Elizabeth and Michael had lived with their guilt, he had simply run from everything. "Jennifer," he called, approaching the nurse. "How's Mrs. Eleanor?" "Better. Her fever has gone down a lot, but she's still very weak. She needs proper medical care." "How long until we can get out of here?" Jennifer looked out the window. The storm had eased, but it was still raining. "If the rain stops by morning, we might be able to make it down safely, but she'll need help walking." Robert Miller nodded. He glanced around at the group scattered throughout the cabin. Besides Mrs. Eleanor, Jennifer Smith, Michael, Gerald, and Patricia, there were 5 others. A teenager around 17, 2 middle-aged women, a man in his 60s, and a younger man who appeared to be married to one of the women. "Everyone," Robert said, raising his voice to get their attention. "I know the situation is tough, but we need to get organized. We'll spend the night here, and in the morning, we'll all head down together to get medical help for Mrs. Eleanor and anyone else who needs it." "What about food?" the teenager asked. "I'm starving." Robert realized he hadn't actually planned on feeding 10 people. His pantry was stocked for just 1 person, and even then, it was pretty basic. "I've got some canned goods, rice, beans," he said. "It's not much, but it'll be enough for everyone to have something." "I can help cook," Patricia offered. "Me too," one of the middle-aged women added. As they prepared a simple meal, Robert noticed how the group gradually relaxed. The earlier argument between him and Michael had created tension, but now that they had a practical task, everyone seemed more at ease. "Hey," the teenager said, approaching Robert. "I'm Tyler. Just wanted to say thanks for letting us in. I know it wasn't easy." "Don't mention it, Tyler. Anyone would have done the same." "Nah, bro, not everyone. Plenty of folks would have left us out in the rain." Robert smiled. It was the first genuine smile he'd had in years. "You really live here alone?" Tyler asked. 8 years now. Wow, that's lonely. Don't you miss people?" Robert looked around the cabin, watching everyone talking, laughing, helping each other. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do. A lot." Dinner brought a lighter atmosphere. People shared stories about their lives, their families, their jobs. Robert realized just how disconnected he'd become from the human world. "Robert," Gerald said during the meal, "you said you know these mountains well, right? Like the back of my hand. Did you used to work in tourism?" "I did," Robert confirmed. "Had an eco-tourism business. Took people hiking, camping, that kind of thing." "Why'd you stop?" Robert hesitated, glancing at Michael. "Personal reasons," he finally said. "That's a shame," Jennifer remarked. "Must have been an interesting life." "It was," Robert admitted. "I loved that job. Loved showing people the beauty of these mountains, teaching them about nature, about preservation." "You ever think about going back?" Robert didn't answer right away. For 8 years, he'd assumed his old life was over for good. But now, talking to these people, he wondered if maybe it wasn't too late to start again. "I don't know," he said finally. "It's been a long time." After dinner, they arranged sleeping spaces. The cabin was small, so they had to improvise. Robert gave his cot to Mrs. Eleanor and settled on the floor with the others. "Robert," Michael called out when the lights were off and everyone was settling in. "Yeah? Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Did you ever remarry? Have kids?" Robert was silent for a few seconds. "No. Never got involved with anyone again." "Wow," Michael murmured. 8 years alone. It was my choice." "Not a good one," Michael said softly. "What about you?" Robert asked, changing the subject. "How have these years been for you?" "Hard, really hard. Elizabeth was never truly happy with me. I always knew it was just guilt and pity she felt. Did you two get married?" "Yes. But it was an unhappy marriage from day one. She cried every night, said your name in her sleep." Robert Miller felt a confusing mix of satisfaction and sadness. On one hand, he was glad to know Elizabeth had suffered the consequences of her betrayal. On the other, it was painful to imagine the woman he once loved living in constant misery. And after she passed, I was completely lost. I realized I'd wasted 8 years of my life on a lie I created myself, and I'd lost my brother forever. "Not forever," said Robert, surprising even himself. "What do you mean?" "We're here talking, aren't we?" Michael fell silent, clearly emotional. "Doesn't mean I've forgiven you," Robert continued. "I still don't know if I ever will. But maybe we can try to be civil with each other." "That's more than I deserve," Michael said, his voice choked. "You're right. It is." Despite the exhaustion from the traumatic night, Robert struggled to sleep. His mind raced, processing all the night's revelations. Learning that Elizabeth had been manipulated completely changed his perspective on everything that had happened. In the early hours, he was woken by a soft groan. Mrs. Eleanor was tossing restlessly on the cot, clearly caught in a nightmare. "No, no," she murmured. "Robert, forgive me. Forgive me, my son." Robert got up quietly and moved closer. "Mrs. Eleanor," he whispered, gently touching her arm. "It's okay, I'm here." She opened her eyes, disoriented. "Robert?" "Yes, it's me. You were having a nightmare." "Oh, my boy." She clutched his hand. "I dreamed you left again, and I never saw you after that." "I'm not leaving," Robert said, not fully considering the weight of the promise. "Do you forgive me, son, for not standing up for you when I should have?" Robert felt a lump in his throat. "There's nothing to forgive, Mrs. Eleanor. You've always been perfect to me." "No, I wasn't. I knew something was wrong, but I stayed silent out of cowardice. You were in an impossible situation, your daughter on one side, me on the other. But I loved you like a son. I should have protected you." Robert held her hand in both of his. "You always did protect me. You were the only real mother I had after mine passed." Mrs. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "You've always been the son of my heart. I always told Elizabeth she was lucky to find a man like you." "And she was," came a voice behind them. Robert turned and saw Jennifer Smith, who had woken up and was watching the exchange. "Sorry," she said. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I thought you might be unwell." "It's fine," Robert said. Jennifer stepped closer and checked Mrs. Eleanor's temperature. "Her fever's risen a bit," she said. "I'll give her another dose of medicine." As Jennifer prepared the medication, Mrs. Eleanor kept hold of Robert's hand. "Son, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When we leave here, will you come home with me? At least for a few days?" Robert hesitated. The thought of leaving his cabin, his safe isolation, terrified him. "Mrs. Eleanor, please. I've been so alone since Elizabeth, since she left. The house is too big, too empty." Robert glanced around the cabin. For 8 years, this tiny space had been his entire world. The idea of returning to civilization, dealing with people every day, facing the memories, it seemed impossible. But for the first time in years, he felt a genuine desire to reconnect with the world. "All right," he finally said, "at least for a few days." The smile that spread across Mrs. Eleanor's face was worth all the fear Robert Miller had been feeling. "Thank you, my son. Thank you." Jennifer Smith finished administering the medicine and returned to her spot. Robert stayed awake beside Mrs. Eleanor until she fell asleep again, and only then did he go back to his space on the floor. When he finally managed to sleep, he dreamed of Elizabeth. In the dream, she was young again, like when they first met. They were walking along a mountain trail, holding hands, laughing at some joke he couldn't remember. "Do you forgive me?" Elizabeth asked in the dream. "I already have," he replied. "And Michael? I'm trying. He suffered a lot too, you know." "I know. Come back to life, Robert. You still have so much to live for." Robert woke up with tears in his eyes. The dream had felt so real that for a moment he thought Elizabeth was truly there. Dawn brought relief. The rain had completely stopped. Robert got up and looked out the window. The sky was clear, and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the lush mountain landscape. "Good morning," said Jennifer, who was already awake, checking on Mrs. Eleanor. "Good morning. How is she?" "Better. Her fever went down a lot overnight. I think she'll be able to make the descent." Slowly, everyone began waking up. The morning atmosphere was completely different from the tension of the night before. People seemed more relaxed, closer. Robert prepared a simple breakfast with what was left in the pantry. As everyone ate, they organized the descent. "The trail to the main road will take about 3 hours," Robert explained. "We'll take it slow, pausing whenever someone needs to." "And from there, can we get to the hospital?" Jennifer asked. "There's a health clinic in the village, about 15 minutes from the road. If they can't handle it there, they'll call an ambulance to take us to Asheville." As they packed the few belongings each had, Robert approached Michael. "Michael, hey, that letter you mentioned yesterday, from Elizabeth, do you still have it?" Michael nodded and pulled the yellowed envelope from his pocket. "Are you sure you want to read it?" Robert took the letter with trembling hands. "No, but I think I need to." He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the handwritten pages. The writing was unmistakably Elizabeth's, that rounded handwriting he knew so well. "My dearest Robert, if you're reading this letter, it means Michael finally found you and had the courage to deliver it. I don't know if I'll still be alive when this happens, but I hope so because I need to ask for your forgiveness in person. I know no words can undo the harm I caused you. I know I destroyed our life, our family, our dreams, but I need you to know it was the biggest mistake of my life. Michael showed me those fake photos when I was already confused, when our marriage was going through a rough patch. I believed them because I wanted to, because it was easier to blame you than admit I was being unfaithful. I only discovered the truth about the photos when it was too late. You had disappeared, and I couldn't find you. I tried for 2 years, Robert. I spent all my savings trying to track you down. When I finally gave up, I realized I'd lost the love of my life over a lie. I was never happy again, not for a single day. Michael tried to make me happy, but how can you be happy with someone you don't love? I'm writing this letter because I'm sick and may not have much time left. I want you to know I regret it every day. I want you to know you were the great love of my life and you always will be. I don't ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I only ask that you don't waste your life on bitterness. You're too good a person to live in pain. If one day you can forgive me, forgive Michael too. He's suffering as much as I am. Maybe more. I love you forever, Elizabeth. P.S. Mrs. Eleanor always knew you were innocent. She tried to convince me many times, but I was blind. Take good care of her because she loves you like a son. Robert Miller finished reading the letter with tears in his eyes. He felt a mix of relief, sadness, and something that might have been peace. Finally, he had all the answers he needed. "Robert?" called Michael, clearly nervous. "What did you think?" Robert folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "I think she was right," he said finally. "About what?" "About not wasting life with bitterness." Michael didn't respond, but Robert saw tears in his brother's eyes. "Everyone, ready to go?" called Gerald. "The sun's coming up, and it'll be better to walk before it gets too hot." Robert picked up a backpack and put in a few essentials: water, some leftover medicine, a rope. He looked around the cabin one last time. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now continuing. For 8 years, those 4 walls had been his prison and his refuge. Now, for the first time, he felt ready to leave them behind. "Ready?" asked Jennifer Smith. "Ready," replied Robert. The descent started slowly. Mrs. Eleanor was doing much better, but was still weak, so Robert and Michael took turns helping her through the toughest parts. The whole group stayed together. No one left behind. "Robert," called Tyler, the teenager, during a rest stop, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How did you survive 8 years alone here? Didn't you go crazy?" Robert smiled. "Almost did. There were times I seriously thought about giving up on everything." "But what kept you alive?" Robert thought for a few seconds. "I think it was fear," he said finally. "Fear of dying, fear of living. I ended up choosing a life that was neither living nor dying." "And now?" asked Patricia, "after everything that happened tonight?" "Now I think I'm ready to try really living." As they walked, Robert realized how disconnected he'd become from the simple pleasure of being in nature. During his years of isolation, the mountains had just been the backdrop of his seclusion. Now, walking with others, he rediscovered the beauty of the landscape. "It's beautiful here," Jennifer remarked, stopping to admire the view of a valley covered in lush forest. "Yeah," Robert agreed. "Always has been," agreed. "I guess I just stopped seeing it." "What do you mean?" "When you're depressed, you can't see beauty in anything. Everything turns gray, dull. And now you can see it?" Robert looked around. The green mountains, the blue sky, the wildflowers along the trail. Everything seemed more alive, more vibrant. "I'm starting to," he admitted. Gerald, who was walking ahead, suddenly stopped. "What is it?" asked Robert. "Did you hear that?" Everyone fell silent, listening. From the valley below, they could hear the sound of engines. "It's the rescue team," Robert said. "They must have been searching for you since you didn't make it home yesterday." "So we're almost saved," Jennifer said, clearly relieved. "We're all saved," Robert corrected, looking at Michael and then at Mrs. Eleanor. When they finally reached the road, they found a search operation in full swing. There were 2 fire trucks, an ambulance, and several people looking for the missing group. "There they are!" someone shouted as they emerged from the trail. Within minutes, they were surrounded by rescuers, family members, and onlookers. Mrs. Eleanor was immediately attended to by the ambulance paramedics, while the other injured also received medical care. "Sir," called one of the firefighters, approaching Robert Miller, "were you the one who helped these people?" "I just offered shelter," said Robert. "Anyone would have done the same." "I'm not so sure," replied the firefighter. "A lot of folks wouldn't have opened their door on a night like last night." Robert didn't respond, but noticed several people in the group recounting the story to their families and the rescuers. Apparently, he was being portrayed as some kind of hero. "Robert," called Mrs. Eleanor from inside the ambulance. He walked over. "Don't forget the promise you made me, okay?" "What promise?" "To come home with me." Robert looked around. His isolated life in the mountains suddenly felt very distant. The idea of returning to that empty cabin, to that lonely routine, no longer made sense. "I won't forget," he promised. "Mr. Robert Miller?" called a woman's voice. He turned and saw a young woman with a notepad in hand. "I'm a reporter for the local paper. I'd like to ask a few questions about what happened." "I have nothing to say," said Robert, clearly uncomfortable. "But you saved 10 people. It's an inspiring story." "I didn't save anyone. I just offered a place to spend the night." Jennifer Smith stepped forward. "Robert, you were so much more than that," she said. "You went down the mountain in the middle of a storm to get medicine for Mrs. Eleanor. You risked your life for people you didn't even know. And you shared your food, your home, everything you had," added Tyler. Robert realized that somehow he had become the center of attention. The idea made him extremely uneasy. "Folks, I'll be going now," he said, trying to slip away discreetly. "Wait," called Michael. "Are you really going to Mrs. Eleanor's house?" "Yes, at least for a few days." "And after that?" Robert thought about the question. For the first time in 8 years, the future seemed like a blank page, full of possibilities. "I don't know, we'll see." "If you want." Michael hesitated. "If you ever want to talk, I'm staying at my parents' place. They were really happy to hear you were okay." Robert nodded. "Maybe. No promises, but maybe." "That's more than I deserve," said Michael. "It's true, it is." Robert said goodbye to the group and rode in the ambulance with Mrs. Eleanor to the hospital in Asheville. During the ride, she held his hand the entire time. "Thank you for coming back into my life, son," she said. "Thank you for never giving up on me," replied Robert. At the hospital, Mrs. Eleanor underwent some tests and was discharged by late afternoon. The doctor said she had had an infection but was fully recovered. "Now you're coming home with me," she said as they left the hospital. Mrs. Eleanor's house was in a residential neighborhood of Asheville. It was a simple but cozy home, filled with plants and photographs. Robert recognized several pictures of himself and Elizabeth scattered around the living room. "I never took any down," said Mrs. Eleanor, noticing his gaze. "You've always been part of this family." Robert picked up a photo where he and Elizabeth were laughing during a picnic. She must have been about 25 in the picture, and he was 27. They looked so young, so happy. "It doesn't hurt to look at these photos anymore," he said, surprised by his own reaction. "That's good," said Mrs. Eleanor. "It means you're healing." Over dinner, Robert told her about his 8 years in the mountains. He spoke of the loneliness, the depression, how he had convinced himself he deserved to suffer. "You never deserved to suffer," said Mrs. Eleanor. "I were the victim, not the guilty one. But I made mistakes too," admitted Robert. "I worked too much, didn't give Elizabeth enough attention. Maybe if I'd been a better husband—" "No," interrupted Mrs. Eleanor firmly. "Every couple goes through hard times. That doesn't justify cheating, and it certainly doesn't justify the lies Michael made up." Robert Miller nodded. For years, he'd blamed himself for the marriage falling apart. It was freeing to finally accept that the betrayal wasn't his fault. "Mrs. Eleanor, can I ask you something?" "Of course, son. Did you really suspect the photos were fake?" Mrs. Eleanor sighed. "Suspect? No, I knew. I'd known you for 15 years, Robert. I knew you wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone hit a woman." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was my daughter on one side and my son-in-law on the other. And because Elizabeth was so convinced, I even doubted my own judgment." "That must have been hard." "It was the hardest years of my life," Mrs. Eleanor admitted. "Watching my daughter destroy her life and yours and not being able to stop it. You did what you could." "No, I didn't. I should have confronted Michael from the start. I should have demanded to see the original photos. I should have protected you." Robert held his mother-in-law's hand. "You couldn't have known the photos were fake. And even if you had, Elizabeth might not have believed you." "Maybe. But I'll never stop feeling guilty." "Then we're both the same," Robert said. "I feel guilty too, for walking away from everyone when I found out about the affair." "You were devastated. It was understandable." "It was selfish," Robert corrected. "I only thought about my pain, not the people who loved me and were left with no answers." They sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in thought. "Robert," Mrs. Eleanor finally said. "Yes?" "What will you do now?" Robert considered the question. For the first time in 8 years, he had to think about the future. I don't know. I think I need to get used to being around people again. You can stay here as long as you like. This house has always been yours too. Thank you, but I can't stay forever. I need to rebuild my life. What would you like to do? Robert thought about the conversation he'd had with the group the night before. For the first time in years, he remembered how much he'd loved working in ecotourism. Maybe I'll go back to tourism. I missed showing people the mountains. That would be wonderful, Mrs. Eleanor said, smiling. You were always so good at it. First, I need to catch up. A lot must have changed in 8 years. Definitely. But the important things haven't. You know these mountains better than anyone, and you have a gift for making people fall in love with nature. Robert smiled. It was true. He'd always had a knack for teaching about conservation and sharing the secrets of the Appalachian Mountains with visitors. I'll think about it. That night, Robert slept in a real bed for the first time in years. The room Mrs. Eleanor had prepared for him was simple but comfortable, with a window overlooking a garden full of flowers. He woke in the early hours to the sound of someone crying. He got up to check. Mrs. Eleanor was in the living room, holding a photo of Elizabeth. Mrs. Eleanor, are you okay? She turned, wiping her tears. Sorry to wake you, son. Sometimes I get like this in the middle of the night. Robert sat beside her on the couch. You miss her. Every day, no matter how much I knew she was suffering, how unhappy her marriage to Michael was, she was still my daughter. Of course you miss her. She was your girl. And you? Mrs. Eleanor asked. Do you still miss her? Robert thought about it. I miss the Elizabeth I knew. The cheerful, affectionate woman full of plans that I married. That Elizabeth, I'll miss her forever. She was still the same person, Robert Miller. Just lost. Maybe. But the Elizabeth who betrayed me, who believed I could hit her, that one I can't miss. Mrs. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Did you forgive her? Robert thought about the letter Elizabeth had written, the words of regret and love. I'm trying. I think forgiveness is a process, not a moment. It really is. I'm still learning to forgive myself. You didn't do anything wrong. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. That is doing something wrong. Robert understood that Mrs. Eleanor carried a burden of guilt as heavy as his own. Both had been victims of Michael's manipulation, yet they blamed themselves for not acting differently. You know what Jennifer Smith told me yesterday, Robert said. What? That holding on to resentment only hurts ourselves. I think the same goes for guilt. Mrs. Eleanor smiled through her tears. That girl is wise. She is. She offered me a job, you know. How so? She works at a clinic that needs doctors. Found out I graduated from medical school before opening the tourism company. Will you take it? I don't know. It's been 15 years since I practiced medicine. But the knowledge doesn't disappear, and you were always an excellent doctor. Robert had earned his medical degree, but his passion for nature had always outweighed his interest in traditional medicine. That's why he'd left the profession to start an ecotourism business. Maybe I could combine the two, he mused aloud. How so? Wellness-focused ecotourism, therapeutic hikes, nature immersion for people recovering from depression, anxiety. Mrs. Eleanor's eyes lit up. That would be perfect. You could help others going through what you've experienced. It's just an idea, Robert said, but I think it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. Who better to teach about overcoming than someone who's done it? Robert smiled. For the first time in 8 years, he felt he had a purpose, a direction. I think I'll call Jennifer Smith tomorrow. You should. The next day, Robert called the hospital in Asheville and reached Jennifer. Robert, I'm so glad you called, she said, clearly happy to hear his voice. Jennifer, about that job you mentioned. Interested? Maybe. But I wanted to propose something different. Robert explained his idea of combining medicine with therapeutic tourism. Jennifer was thrilled. That's exactly what our region needs, she said. So many people are looking for alternatives to treat depression and anxiety. Do you think it's viable? I think it could be revolutionary. Do you know anyone in tourism who could help? Robert smiled. I've got a few contacts. I'll make some calls. After hanging up, Robert realized it was the first time in 8 years he was planning for the future, and for the first time in a long while, the future looked promising. "How did it go?" Mrs. Eleanor asked when he hung up. "I think I'm back in the game," Robert said with a smile. Over the following days, Robert began rebuilding his network. He discovered many of his former clients and partners were still active, and several were intrigued by his new idea. "Robert?" exclaimed Gerald, his old business partner in the tourism company, when they met at a cafe in Asheville. "Man, I looked for you for years. Where were you hiding?" "It's a long story," Robert said. "I'll tell you later. Right now, I want your thoughts on an idea." Robert explained his therapeutic tourism concept. Gerald was fascinated. "It's brilliant," he said. "I have several clients who are looking for exactly that. Stressed out people, executives in burnout, folks recovering from depression. Would you be open to partnering on the project?" "Open to it? Bro, I've been waiting 8 years for you to come back." Robert Miller felt an emotion he'd forgotten existed. Excitement. For the first time since the betrayal, he was genuinely thrilled about something. "Then let's make it happen." During the week, Robert met with Jennifer Smith, Michael, and other potential partners. The project began to take shape. It would be a company offering therapeutic tourism packages, combining nature hikes with medical and psychological support. "We can start small," Jennifer said during a meeting, "maybe with groups of 5 to 10 people at a time." "And we could use your mountain cabin as a base," Michael suggested. Robert hesitated. The idea of returning to the cabin, but now to welcome people instead of isolating himself, was both appealing and frightening. "I'll think about it," he said. That night, he talked to Mrs. Eleanor about the possibility. "I think it would be perfect," she said, "turning the place of your suffering into a place of healing for others. I don't know if I'm ready to go back there. You don't have to decide today. The project can start somewhere else, and when you're comfortable, you can expand." Robert nodded. Mrs. Eleanor was right. He didn't have to force himself into anything he wasn't ready for. A week later, while walking through downtown Asheville, Robert bumped into a familiar face. "Michael," he said, surprised. "Robert," Michael replied, equally startled. "How are you?" "Good. Better than I've been in a long time." "That's great. I heard you're staying with Mrs. Eleanor." "Temporarily. I'm getting my life in order." "And how are things between you two?" Robert considered the question. During his time at Mrs. Eleanor's house, he'd reflected a lot on his relationship with Michael. "I'm still processing everything," he admitted honestly. "I won't lie and say everything's fine, but I'm not angry anymore." "You're not?" "I'm sad, I feel pity, but I don't feel rage." Michael lowered his eyes. "I understand." "Michael, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you do all that? The betrayal I can almost understand. People fall in love, make mistakes. But the fake photos, the lies, why?" Michael was silent for a few seconds. "Because I was always jealous of you," he finally admitted. "Jealous of me? You were always the smarter, more charismatic, more successful son. Our parents always held you up as an example for me." Robert was stunned. He'd never realized. "I didn't know you felt that way." "How could you? I hid it my whole life, but when I fell for Elizabeth for the first time ever, I had something you wanted. And when she started pulling away from you, I saw an opportunity to take what was mine." "Exactly. And when I realized I'd gone too far, that I'd destroyed everything, I made up lies to justify the unjustifiable." Robert felt a mix of understanding and sorrow. "You destroyed 3 lives out of jealousy." 4, Michael corrected. "Mine too." "That's true." They stood in the middle of the street, 2 brothers who had lost nearly a decade of their relationship to lies and resentment. "Robert," Michael finally said, "I know I don't deserve it, but is there any chance we could be brothers again someday?" Robert thought about the question. For years he'd fantasized about this moment, imagining Michael begging for forgiveness while he dramatically refused. But now, seeing his brother clearly broken by guilt, he felt no desire for revenge. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe, but it'll take time. However much time you need." And you'll have to rebuild my trust from scratch. I know. And we can never go back to how things were before. I understand. Robert Miller took a deep breath. But if you've really changed, if you're truly sorry, maybe we can be something. Not brothers like before, but something. A timid smile appeared on Michael's face. That would be more than I deserve. True, it would be. They said their goodbyes cordially, and Robert returned to Mrs. Eleanor's house with the sense that he'd closed another painful chapter of his life. How was the meeting? Asked Mrs. Eleanor, noticing his thoughtful expression. Enlightening, said Robert. I think I finally understand why everything happened. Did that make you feel better? In a way, yes. Understanding isn't the same as forgiving, but it helps you move forward. 2 weeks later, Robert received an unexpected call. Hello? Robert Miller? It's Tyler. Tyler, the kid from the group that took shelter in my cabin. That's right. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from Mrs. Eleanor. Of course not. How are you? Good, bro. Listen, I called because I wanted to invite you to something. What is it? I'm giving a presentation at school about our experience in the mountains. I was wondering if you'd come talk to the kids. Robert was surprised. Talk about what? About overcoming challenges, about how you managed to start over after so much suffering. I think it would be inspiring for the young people. The idea of speaking publicly about his experience made Robert nervous, but he also sensed it could be important. When would it be? Next week. Would you do it? I will, said Robert, surprising himself. The following week, Robert stood before a room full of curious teenagers. At first he was nervous, but as he began speaking about his experience, he noticed the kids were genuinely interested. So you were alone for 8 years? Asked a girl. I was, and it was the worst decision of my life. Why? Because isolation doesn't heal anything. It just makes the pain last longer. And what did you learn from all this? Asked a boy. Robert thought about the question. I learned that running from problems solves nothing. I learned that holding on to resentment only hurts yourself. And I learned it's never too late to start over. But how did you manage to forgive the people who hurt you so much? I'm still learning to forgive, admitted Robert. But I've realized forgiving isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't serious. Forgiving is choosing not to let the bitterness keep controlling your life. After the talk, several kids came up with personal questions. Robert noticed many of them were dealing with their own family, relationship, and personal struggles. Thanks for coming, said Tyler when everyone had left. I think you helped a lot of people today. Thanks for inviting me. It was important for me too. How so? It made me realize my experience might help others. That the suffering could have a purpose. Driving home, Robert realized he'd found another piece of the puzzle for his new life. Beyond therapeutic tourism, he could also give motivational talks, helping people going through situations like his. When he got home, he found Mrs. Eleanor waiting with a strange expression. Did something happen? He asked, concerned. We had a visitor today. Who? Jennifer Smith. And she brought someone. Who? Mrs. Eleanor smiled. A psychologist who works with her at the hospital. They want to make you a proposal. Robert frowned, curious. What kind of proposal? They'd better explain it themselves. They're coming back tomorrow afternoon. The next day, Jennifer Smith arrived accompanied by a woman in her 40s with curly hair and a warm smile. Robert Miller. This is Dr. Rachel Thompson. She's a clinical psychologist and runs a rehabilitation program for people with severe depression. Nice to meet you, said Rachel, shaking his hand. Jennifer told me your story, and I was very impressed. Thank you, Robert replied, unsure how to respond. Robert, have you ever considered using your experience to help other patients? Rachel asked. How do you mean? We have several patients who have socially isolated themselves because of depression, some for years like you, and we know one of the biggest challenges is convincing them that returning to a normal life is possible. Robert began to see where this was going. You want me to talk to these patients? Exactly, said Jennifer. Who better to show that recovery is possible than someone who's been through it? But I'm not a psychologist. I don't have the training for that. It wouldn't be formal therapy, Rachel explained. It would be more like sharing your testimony, a living example of overcoming. Robert considered the proposal. The idea of helping people going through what he had endured was very appealing. How would it work? We could start with small groups, Jennifer said. 5 or 6 people at a time. You'd share your story, answer questions, maybe do some group activities. And it could be combined with the therapeutic tourism you're developing, Rachel added. Imagine group sessions in nature, therapeutic hikes, connecting with the environment as part of treatment. Robert felt a growing excitement. The idea of combining his personal experience, his medical background, and his love for nature into something that helped others seemed perfect. I'd be willing to try, he finally said. Really? Jennifer smiled broadly. Really, but I'll need guidance. I don't want to do more harm than good. Of course, Rachel said. I'd oversee the whole process, and you could take some short courses on psychological first aid. When could we start? How about a month from now? Jennifer suggested. That would give you time to prepare and us time to organize the first group. Robert nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. A month sounds good. After Jennifer and Rachel left, Robert stayed talking with Mrs. Eleanor about the proposal. I'm proud of you, she said. Why? For turning your pain into purpose. Not everyone can do that. I haven't yet, I'm just trying. But you already have, son. The simple fact that you're willing to help others shows you've overcome the worst. Robert thought about Mrs. Eleanor's words. It was true. He no longer felt like the broken man who had fled to the mountain 8 years earlier. I think I'm ready to go back to the cabin, he said suddenly. Really. Not to live there, but to visit, to make peace with that place. When do you want to go? Tomorrow? Would you come with me? Mrs. Eleanor smiled. I would. I think it would be good for me, too, to see where you spent all those years. The next day, Robert and Mrs. Eleanor made their way up to the cabin in the mountains. As they climbed, Robert shared stories about his isolated life, the hardships he'd faced, and how he'd learned to survive alone. You must have felt so lonely, Mrs. Eleanor remarked during a rest stop. Very. Especially in the early years. There were times I thought I'd lose my mind from the solitude. What kept you sane? Robert thought about the question. I guess routine. I created a very strict routine, and that gave me a sense of control. And I also think part of me still held on to hope. Hope for what? That one day I'd be able to return to life. When they reached the cabin, Robert Miller felt a confusing mix of emotions. The place seemed smaller than he remembered, more fragile. Mrs. Eleanor looked around with curiosity and a touch of sadness. This is where you lived, she said, not as a question but as a statement. It was. For 8 years, this was my entire world. It's a beautiful place, Mrs. Eleanor said, but it must have been very lonely. Robert opened the cabin door. Everything was exactly as he had left it a few weeks earlier. The books on the makeshift shelf, the simple bed, the neatly arranged kitchen utensils. My goodness, Mrs. Eleanor murmured as she stepped inside. How did you manage to live with so little? When you're depressed, you don't need much. In fact, having too much only made things harder. Mrs. Eleanor picked up one of the books from the shelf, a worn volume of poetry. You always loved reading, she observed. It was one of the few things that still brought me joy, reading and walking. And writing? Did you write anything? Robert hesitated, then walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. He pulled out a few handwritten notebooks. I kept a journal, every day for 8 years. May I see? Robert handed her one of the more recent notebooks. Mrs. Eleanor opened it to a random page and read silently. Robert, she said, tears in her eyes. There was so much pain in these pages. There was, but there was also hope, even when I didn't realize it. Mrs. Eleanor continued flipping through the journal. You wrote about me, she said, surprised. I wrote about everyone I missed, about you, about friends, about the life I'd lost, and about Elizabeth, especially about Elizabeth, mostly in the early years. Mrs. Eleanor closed the notebook and looked at Robert. You carried all this inside you for 8 years. It must have been an unbearable burden. It was, but it was also necessary. I needed to process everything alone before I could return to the world. And now, Do you still need this place? Robert looked around the cabin one more time. He realized he no longer felt the mix of refuge and imprisonment the place used to evoke. Not to hide, he said finally, but maybe to help others find themselves. How so? I'm thinking of turning this place into a retreat center, a space where people in situations like mine can come to reconnect with themselves and nature. That would be perfect, Mrs. Eleanor said, turning the place of your suffering into a place of healing for others. That's exactly what I'm thinking. They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the cabin and planning the changes needed to welcome visitors. Robert realized he had finally found the missing piece in the puzzle of his new life. When they descended the mountain at the end of the day, Robert felt completely different from the person who had climbed up that morning. He had made peace with his past and was ready to fully embrace his future. "Thank you for coming with me," he said to Mrs. Eleanor on the way back. "Thank you for bringing me. It was important for me too to understand where you spent all those years. And what did you think? I think you're stronger than you realize. Surviving alone for so long with so much pain and still coming out of it wanting to help others, that's extraordinary." Robert smiled. For the first time in his life, he felt proud of himself. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of the story and where you see us. If you have something to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Robert made the right decisions? We're eager to read your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories.